Welcome, and thank you for joining me. This is the first episode in a series on IT project portfolio management, but not quite in the usual way. We are not only going to talk about scoring models, governance boards, prioritization templates, and strategy maps, even though all of those things matter. We're also going to talk about what portfolio management actually looks like inside real organizations. And that means we have to talk about power, visibility, timing, reputation, informal influence, and uncertainty. Because if we do not talk about those things, then we are not really talking about portfolios as they are lived. We are only talking about portfolios as they are imagined. So let me begin with a simple claim. The best project does not always win. In fact, in many organizations, it often does not. And most experienced people know this. They may not say it directly in a portfolio meeting. They may not write it in a governance document. But they know it. They have seen good projects ignored, delayed, underfunded, or quietly allowed to fade away. And they have seen weaker projects survive much longer than they should. Sometimes those weaker projects even become flagship initiatives. They get executive attention. They get reporting space. They get defended. They get saved. They become difficult to challenge, not because they're clearly delivering the most value, but because other forces are at work. Now, if you are new to project portfolio management, this may sound cynical. It may sound like I'm saying that portfolio management is fake or arbitrary or just political theater. That is not what I mean. Portfolio management is necessary. It is valuable. It is one of the few places where organizations try to make sense of competing demands in a structured way. The problem is not that portfolio management is useless. The problem is that many portfolio conversations are built on a simplification. They assume that once we have a business case, a set of criteria, some scores, and a governance forum, decisions will naturally move toward the highest value options. But real organizations do not work like that. They are not neutral machines for allocating rational attention. They are social systems. They are historical systems. They are political systems. And portfolios sit right in the middle of all of that. When we say the best project, what do we actually mean? Best according to whom? Best by what measure? Best for this year or over 5 years? Best for the official strategy or best for operational stability? Best for the customer, the citizen, the manager, the sponsor, the architecture team, or the people who have to maintain the thing afterwards? Even at that level, the language begins to soften. Because what looks like a clear comparison on paper often turns out to be a clash between different kinds of value. One project may promise visible transformation. Another may reduce a deep technical risk that nobody outside IT can easily see. One may align neatly with current leadership rhetoric. Another may solve a stubborn operational problem that staff have struggled with for years. Which one is best? The answer depends very much on what the organization is able to see, what it wants to reward, and what story it is ready to believe. And that word story matters more than we often admit. Projects do not enter portfolios as pure facts. They enter as narratives. Someone frames a problem. Someone describes an opportunity. Someone gives numbers a meaning. Someone makes the work sound urgent, strategic, responsible, innovative, defensive, necessary, or overdue. And that narrative work is not a small detail around the edges. It is often central. Because in portfolio settings, information is never complete. Time is limited. Attention is scarce. Decision makers do not live equally close to all domains. So what they often encounter is not the project itself, but an interpretation of the project. And some interpretations travel better than others. A project with a strong sponsor has an advantage, even before any formal scoring begins. That does not automatically mean corruption or bad intent. It simply means that projects attached to respected, visible, or credible people are more likely to be heard, understood, protected, and revisited. A senior sponsor can keep a project alive through uncertainty in ways that a less visible manager often cannot. A confident sponsor can make risk sound manageable. An influential sponsor can turn a local issue into an enterprise issue. They can create legitimacy around a proposal before it is ever compared on equal terms with others. Again, this is not necessarily sinister. It is how organizations work. Right? Trust and status shape interpretation. But the result is still important. Projects do not compete in a vacuum. They compete in fields of influence. Timing also matters enormously. You can have a very strong project idea and still lose because the organization is simply not in the mood for it. Maybe leadership is focused on cost control, and your proposal sounds like capability building. Maybe a recent incident has made cybersecurity the dominant concern, and your user experience project suddenly feels hard to defend. Maybe the organization is exhausted from previous change efforts, and another transformation initiative sounds like one disruption too many. Maybe a new executive has arrived with a preferred language and a preferred agenda, and projects that fit that agenda suddenly become easier to fund. The same project presented 6 months earlier or a year later may receive a completely different response. So when we say the best project did not win, sometimes what we really mean is that the project arrived at the wrong moment. Visibility is another major factor. Some types of value are easy to show. A new service, a redesigned interface, a launch, a dashboard, a mobile app, a feature. These are visible. They photograph well, they fit into presentation decks, they help leaders feel that movement is happening. Other kinds of value are far less visible. Integration cleanup, identity and access improvements, architectural restructuring, data quality foundations, platform stabilization, logging and monitoring capabilities, lifecycle management. These things may be strategically essential, but they are harder to dramatize. They do not always create immediate applause. They are harder to explain quickly, especially to people outside the technical domain. So, even when portfolio leaders know intellectually that invisible enablers matter, visible projects often have an advantage simply because they're easier to discuss and easier to celebrate. And this creates a pattern we see again and again in IT portfolios. The portfolio says it wants strategic value, but it repeatedly favors visible change over invisible conditions for change. It says it cares about long-term sustainability, but it struggles to protect work whose benefits are distributed, delayed, or mainly preventive. It says it wants to manage the whole, but in practice it often rewards what can be narrated simply. Not always, but often enough that experienced people can feel it in the room. Another reason the best project does not always win is that organizations are not only choosing between opportunities, they are also choosing between risks. And risk is not objective in the way many governance systems pretend it is. Risk is interpreted socially. Some risks feel familiar and manageable because the organization has language for them. Others feel vague and uncomfortable because they challenge current assumptions or expose weak ownership. A project that proposes something new may be treated as risky not only because the work itself is uncertain, but because responsibility for the uncertainty is harder to distribute. Meanwhile, a more traditional project may feel safer. even when it quietly carries serious long-term risk because it fits a familiar delivery pattern. In that sense, portfolios often confuse familiar with safe. This is one of the most important points in the whole episode. Organizations do not only select projects based on expected value, they also select projects based on what kind of discomfort they are willing to tolerate. Some are more willing to tolerate cost risk than political embarrassment. Some are more willing to tolerate technical fragility than governance ambiguity. Some are more willing to tolerate delay than public failure. These preferences are rarely written down as portfolio criteria, but they shape decisions all the time. And once you start seeing that, a lot of seemingly strange portfolio behavior becomes more understandable. Let us make this concrete with a simple scenario. Imagine an organization with room to meaningfully advance only one of 3 proposed initiatives. The first is a customer-facing digital service redesign. It is visible, modern, easy to explain, and strongly aligned with leadership language about innovation and user focus. The second is a foundational identity and access modernization effort. It addresses growing security risk, technical fragmentation, and operational overhead. But it is difficult to explain in compelling non-technical terms. The third is a data integration initiative that would improve decision quality across multiple units over time, but its benefits are indirect and spread across the organization rather than concentrated in one visible outcome. Now ask yourself, which project is best? Already the question becomes unstable. The service redesign may produce visible movement and stakeholder satisfaction. The identity modernization may reduce deep risk and strengthen resilience. The integration effort may unlock future effectiveness across many areas. There is no simple, neutral answer. But in many organizations, the first option has a strong structural advantage. It is more legible. It sounds strategic. It can be communicated externally. It gives leadership something to point to. And if it also has a senior sponsor who speaks well and carries credibility, it may win even if, from a long-term systems perspective, the second or third option would create greater overall value. At this point, some people respond by saying, well, that is exactly why we need better prioritization models, better scoring, better criteria, better governance discipline. And yes, to a degree, that is true. Poorly designed portfolio processes can absolutely make these problems worse. If criteria are vague, if scoring is inconsistent, if assumptions are hidden, if dependency analysis is weak, then organizational bias has even more room to operate. Better process helps, better transparency helps, better challenge in governance forums helps, but we should be careful not to ask the process to solve what is partly a human and institutional condition. Because even very well-designed portfolio systems still rely on interpretation. Someone still defines the criteria. Someone still estimates value. Someone still assigns risk. Someone still decides how much evidence is enough. Someone still decides what counts as strategic. The numbers may look neat at the end, but the path into the numbers is still social. This is why I become cautious whenever people talk about portfolio management as though it were mainly a matter of optimization. Optimization sounds clean. It suggests that if we had enough data and the right model, the correct mix of projects would emerge. But portfolios are not inventory systems. They are not only optimization problems. They are governance problems, sense-making problems, trade-off problems, legitimacy problems. They are places where organizations reveal what they really value, what they are afraid of, what they are willing to postpone, and whose voice carries weight when priorities collide. There is also an emotional dimension here that formal portfolio language rarely acknowledges. Projects are often attached to identity. A project may be someone's big initiative, someone's promise, someone's reputation, someone's effort to create momentum, someone's attempt to demonstrate leadership. Challenging a project is therefore not always experienced as a purely rational act. It can feel like challenging a person, a team, a department, or a strategic identity. This makes it harder to stop weak projects and easier to keep them alive with just enough hope to avoid a difficult conversation. So even before we reach the famous zombie project problem, which I will talk about more in a later episode, we can already see why selection itself is not neutral. Projects are not only proposals, they are attachments. And then there is the issue of fairness. Many organizations want portfolio management to feel fair. They want units to believe they are being heard. They want transparent criteria. They want consistency across proposals. All of that is reasonable. But fairness in portfolios is complicated because uniform treatment is not the same as just treatment. Two proposals may go through the same template and still not be equally representable. One may fit the dominant language of the organization better. One may produce benefits that are easier to count. One may have stakeholders who know how to write business cases. One may come from a technically mature area that can make a stronger evidence-based argument. Another may come from a domain where the need is real but harder to formalize. So even when a process is formally fair, it may still advantage certain types of projects, certain types of departments, and certain types of communicators. This matters in public sector and university settings especially, where value can be complex, distributed, and sometimes difficult to reduce to a simple financial case. A citizen-facing service improvement, a compliance-driven infrastructure renewal, a pedagogical digital support initiative, and an accessibility enhancement may all carry different forms of legitimacy. If portfolio systems over-reward the projects that sound most strategically fashionable or financially legible, quieter, but deeply important work may consistently lose out. And when that happens repeatedly, organizations do not only get skewed portfolios, they also teach their people what kinds of arguments count, what kinds of work receive attention, and what kinds of needs are structurally discounted. So what should we do with this? Do we just become resigned and say that portfolios are political and therefore nothing can be improved? No, not at all. The point of taking these realities seriously is not to abandon structured governance. It is to make governance more honest and therefore more capable. The first step is simply to stop pretending that portfolio decisions are purely technical. If we acknowledge that sponsorship, timing, visibility, narrative strength, and institutional fear shape decisions, then we can begin to design processes that make those forces more discussable rather than leaving them hidden. For example, portfolio boards can deliberately ask not only what value a project offers, but what type of value it offers, who can see it easily and who cannot. They can ask whether visible initiatives are crowding out foundational ones. They can ask whether a project appears strong because it is genuinely compelling or because it is exceptionally well sponsored. They can ask whether a proposal is being judged harshly because it is weak or because it is unfamiliar. They can ask what kinds of work repeatedly struggle to survive the portfolio gate. Those are governance questions, but they are also cultural questions. Another useful move is to create a stronger language for invisible and enabling work. If foundational technical initiatives are constantly disadvantaged because they are hard to narrate, then part of the task is not only analytical, but communicative. Technical leaders need to become better at framing platform, architecture, identity, resilience, and integration work as strategic conditions rather than background maintenance. That does not mean overselling. It means translating invisible dependence into understandable consequence. Because if the portfolio cannot see the conditions that make other projects possible, then it will keep making choices that feel rational in the short term and costly in the long term. A third step is to create more reflective challenge in portfolio forums. Not aggressive challenge for its own sake, but thoughtful challenge. When a highly visible project receives enthusiastic support, someone should be able to ask what is not being seen. When a less visible but structurally important project scores poorly, someone should be able to ask whether the criteria themselves are privileging the wrong forms of clarity. When a sponsor insists that a proposal is strategic, someone should be able to ask in what sense, for whom, and relative to what alternative. These are not bureaucratic obstacles. They are signs of maturity. A good portfolio forum is not one where decisions are easy. Right? It is one where hidden assumptions are more likely to surface. Let me also say something about leaders here. Senior leaders often want portfolios to give them clarity. They want synthesis. They want understandable options. That is entirely reasonable. Nobody can manage a complex organization without simplification. But there is a difference between useful simplification and dangerous simplification. A useful simplification helps a leader see the structure of the problem. A dangerous simplification hides the structure of the problem behind tidy presentation. One of the risks of portfolio reporting is that it can create a false sense of rational order. Columns are aligned. Criteria are scored. Projects are color-coded. Everything appears comparable. But the very neatness of the presentation can hide the unevenness of the underlying reality. And sometimes the most responsible thing a portfolio leader can do is not to present a cleaner answer, but to preserve the right amount of discomfort around an important choice. Because that discomfort is often a sign that the organization is dealing with genuinely different kinds of value. A customer-facing initiative is not the same kind of proposition as an architectural renewal. A compliance response is not the same kind of proposition as a strategic innovation bet. A resilience investment is not the same kind of proposition as a new digital capability. If governance treats them as though they are naturally comparable without remainder, then it creates the illusion of neutrality at the cost of wisdom. So when the best project does not always win, the lesson is not simply that people are biased or that politics has ruined a good system. The deeper lesson is that the idea of best is itself contested, situated, and shaped by organizational conditions. A portfolio is not just a list of projects. It is a live expression of what the organization can recognize, defend, and commit to at a particular moment in time. That is why portfolios are so interesting. They reveal far more than delivery intent. They reveal institutional attention. And once you start looking at portfolios this way, you begin to notice patterns. You notice which units know how to speak the winning language. You notice which forms of value rarely survive translation into the portfolio format. You notice that urgency is often rewarded over depth, that visibility can outperform necessity, that strong sponsorship can act like a hidden multiplier, and that uncomfortable truths are often hardest to fund. You also notice that many people inside organizations feel these tensions very clearly, even when the official language remains clean and procedural. That is why I wanted to start the series here. Before we talk about shadow portfolios, zombie projects, strategy theater, AI investments, public value, or the future of the PMO, we need to clear away one comforting illusion. Portfolio management is not the place where politics disappears and pure strategy takes over. It is the place where politics, strategy, risk, legitimacy, and limited capacity meet each other under pressure. Sometimes that produces thoughtful decisions. Sometimes it produces distorted ones. Usually it produces a mixture of both. So the next time you hear someone say that a portfolio process will ensure the best projects rise to the top, I would suggest treating that statement with care. Ask what best means. Ask who gets to define it. Ask what kinds of value are easiest to see. Ask what risks are considered tolerable and which are not. Ask which proposals arrive with powerful sponsors and which arrive alone. Ask what invisible work has quietly lost again. Ask what kind of future the current portfolio is making easier and what kind of future it is making harder. Because that, in the end, is what portfolio management really does. It does not simply choose projects. It shapes organizational direction by deciding what gets protected, what gets delayed, what gets translated into strategic language, and what remains structurally hard to hear. And perhaps the most important practical question for any organization is not only whether its portfolio is well governed, but whether it is self-aware. Does it understand its own biases? Does it recognize the difference between visible and foundational value? Does it know how sponsorship influences interpretation? Does it have room to challenge attractive narratives? Does it protect work that matters even when that work is hard to celebrate? Those are difficult questions, but they are the kind of questions that make a portfolio more intelligent rather than merely more organized. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, I want to explore the difference between the portfolio you say you have and the portfolio you actually run. Because in many organizations, the official portfolio is only part of the story. Behind it sits a shadow portfolio of urgent fixes, compliance demands, operational disruptions, hidden dependencies, and unplanned work that may be consuming much more of your real capacity than the formal slides ever show. And before we close, let me leave you with one question for your own organization. Which active project is succeeding mainly because of its demonstrated value, and which one may be succeeding because it is visible, well-sponsored, and easy to defend? If that is a hard question to answer, that may already tell you something important about the portfolio you are living with.